Great. So thank you everyone for joining. This should be a really exciting session, and I think kind of really timely as well, as we've seen during the pandemic how important kind of it's been for people working in kind of public services, but also services from other organisations to really use the relationships that they've got with their communities to work in a more agile way, whether that's kind of delivering essentials to kind of to people and kind of working through those relationships to get to everyone in the communities, or whether it's kind of starting to develop more relational ways to actually how you kind of work with people over a longer term, whether that's in terms of strategy or service design or commissioning or other areas as well. This is the first time we're hosting Demos, which is great, and I worked at Demos when I was young, so kind of really pleased to be hosting Polly from Demos today, who's the chief exec of the organisation. And Demos have always been really great at providing that inspiration and constructive challenge about how public services can be more innovative. They focus on more than just public services, so do check out their website. But today's focus is going to be about the kind of the work that Demos have been doing on relational public services. So I'm really delighted, Polly, that you're able to join us today, because I can imagine as chief exec there are a number of demands that are placed upon you. So really great to have you. Before we start, just a kind of heads up on how the session is going to work. We're going to hear from Polly on the work that Demos have been doing on this subject, and then we're going to go into breakouts to actually kind of find out kind of what takeaways you've got kind of from the work that Demos is doing, how your organisation or your team are trying to develop services which are more relational. And kind of what are the challenges and also opportunities you're facing, because this network is also about kind of people from organisations kind of sharing with each other, and it's always a good opportunity to find out what other organisations are doing. So there'll be a mix of presentation and kind of breakout as well. Don't worry too much about taking notes from the slides; they will be shared afterwards. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to yourself, Polly.
Great, thank you so much, Noel. I have got some slides. So you'll see most of the slides rather than me. So it's probably a relatively safe bet that if you are joining this session, you're quite persuaded that relational public services have value and merit. But I wanted to start in this presentation with some thoughts about why I think it matters. And this comes from a set of papers that I've just published. Well, the last one's out next week, called "Making Democracy Work." Just, pretty grand in its ambition, but basically because my view is that our society, but lots and lots of democracies, are really struggling with a huge queue of what you might call the too difficult box, of these extraordinary challenges that we cannot seem to resolve with really dysfunctional politics. And I think that part of the problem is a lack of cohesion in our society. And so the sort of the macro purpose for Demos to exist is to help make the case for a whole range of different processes that can help to pull society together during a period of extraordinary atomization and diversification of interests between different groups. And in the kind of the paper series, I talk about, both the personalization of our economic experiences, the information economy, the fact that we've got 5 generations alive for pretty much the first time in history, all of those different challenges that we face. And I think democracy is really struggling with it. But what is a cohesive society? In my view, it is one which has these strong relationships. First of all, strong relationships, stronger than we've got at the moment, between people and their politics, strong relationships between people and each other, and stronger relationships between people of all kinds and the economy. I think that democracy is an act of compromise. I think so much of how we talk about democracy is the idea that it's about getting what you want. It's how we advertise political parties. But of course, democracy is not how you get what you want. It's how we get what we want. It is a demos. It is not self-government. And I think for us to make those compromises and sacrifices in the collective interest, you have to trust the political system. You have to like each other, the people with whom you're making those compromises. And you also have to feel like the economic system is working both for you as an individual, but for people like you. And that's why I think the relationships matter. The problem is that, economic, social, political, demographic, and technological trends are weakening all of those relationships, all of them, in my view. And I think that the way we make public policy often makes things worse. We're going through an incredibly hyper-partisan era, and lots of the response to that is to be technocratic, to focus on what works and just shout at people and say things like, facts don't care about your feelings, which as a general rule doesn't make any difference to people's feelings. The paper I published last week was called The Humble Policymaker. I think we need to take humility into our policy making and think about ways, not of heroically solving people's problems for them, but trying to build up society's capacity to handle problems, to build that cohesive society that's able to actually choose a way ahead, choose the right way to tackle social care reform, for example, instead of just deciding how we advocate for the way that I individually want or you might individually want. So what do we do at Demos? We are really interested in the process of policymaking, and it has to be participative, because every time you make a policy decision for people on their behalf, you might think you're saving them time and energy, but it's an opportunity cost. You are missing the opportunity to strengthen relationships between people and the political system, and between people and each other. But it's also about the purpose. And this is where relational policy making comes in, and relational public services. The complexity and divisions in our society are huge, absolutely vast, and they are. The vastness is getting larger at an accelerating pace. So in this atomized society, building strong relationships, in my view, is a new but central role for the liberal state. Lots of relationships in society occurred, especially those peer-to-peer relationships, relatively easily by default. But we cannot rely on our economy, our religions, our families, our communities to hold us together. We need to take a much more proactive role. So the final paper in the series, which I'm publishing next week, is called The Gravitational State. It's about that idea that you have a state which is trying to create gravitational forces to pull people back together in the service of a healthy democracy. So how policy should be made, understanding lived experience, involving the public, delegating decision-making to citizens where possible, even if they might make what you think is the wrong choice, prioritizing long-term solutions, and also the purpose. So this is where Demos is kind of focusing our work as we go into the next few years, is we're interested in how policy can actively build these three sets of relationships. Relationships between people and politics. That's a program we're calling Everyday Democracy. The relationship between people and each other, the civic nation, and also the relationships between people and the economy, stakeholder or citizen capitalism. Haven't quite decided, one of the two. And we put into all of our policy making these questions around how do you engineer relationship building by default into service delivery, for example? How do you get more democratic voice? And what I want to talk about today is essentially this is where relational public services fit in. They help us to think through these two pillars of the macro purpose of why Demos exists and how we're trying to hold democracy together. So I'm now going to talk a little bit in more detail, probably more what you expected, around how relational policy making, relational public services might work, particularly at the local government level. And I'm building here on some work done by a colleague of mine who's on the call. Do feel free to reach out to him or to me anytime, ever, called Kieran Cummings, who is a fantastic Demos researcher. We recognise very strongly that the relation approach isn't new. In fact, I'm the trustee of a charity called Shift, which is leading a project with Barking and Dagenham and others called the Relationships Project, right? Like none of this is new. Demos has been writing about it. IPPR have written about it. It's there, right? There's loads of great work out there. What we're trying to do with this programme of work is tap into public views and understand how principles for relational government can be more successful, more responsive, and contribute to this emerging community of practice and expertise, which is why I was so delighted that Noel invited me to speak to you guys today. But for me, there's more to it than what, you know, the first thing people think of often when they think about relational public services is about the thing I've got third on my list, which is the relationship between the user and the provider. So people might, for example, actually, there's a good decade-old IPPR report about this that looks at, for example, midwives and the idea of caseloading midwives, so that you see the same person every time and you build up a relationship with that. And there's lots of evidence that for particular kinds of public services, that relational model can be really valuable. But for me, I want to take a more expansive view of the kind of relationships that I care about. First of all, there is that relationship, a trusting relationship between citizens and decision makers. There's the relationship between the citizens themselves, both as peers of service users, but also networks within communities. And then continuity, that the third thing people probably come to first. So I'm just trying to be provocative by putting it last, but which is about stronger, more predictable relationships between both the user and the provider, blurring that boundary where we can, because often that's a much more successful way, especially of reaching more hard to reach communities. So I'm going to look at each of those. The first, so connection, that sense of how do you build that relationship. In local government, we are in general much better at this. We saw that through COVID, the national government, of being transparent, accessible, encouraging participation, having that confidence to do government with people instead of for people. And again, just to say, I'm really aware that so often the motive to make decisions for people is a generous one. It's a desire to take stuff off their plate, to make life easy. Don't worry, we'll just sort it out. We're the government. And that instinct to let people off the hook of taking responsibility for decision making, for cooperation, for collaboration, is something we have to challenge in ourselves. But not because, I don't think it's malevolent, the desire to govern for people, but nevertheless, it comes at an opportunity cost. That cost of building up what you might think of as a kind of democratic skill set of networks and capabilities among citizens. So we have to absolutely collaborate more with people on local decision making. So this is Kieran's research. So what people told us was that to feel connected, you need to feel both listened to and have a clear means of feedback. That was absolutely top of the priority list for citizens in their relationships with local government. Also really important to have transparency in both operations, policy design and data collection. And again, these two things are correlated. If you feel like you have a say, then you feel like it's transparent. The more that they're self-reinforcing. And we held a series of focus groups with citizens, and it's really interesting the way, you know, local authorities are in this really difficult position, constrained by finance, constrained by, you know, statutory obligations, and very often sort of know that they can't fix things. And yet very often to citizens, the local authority is accountable, feels responsible anyway. And so it's complicated to navigate that through conversations. But the more open you are, and this is just another vox pop from a focus group, is things like neighbourhood forums, the opportunity to see people, to look them in the eye and ask them questions, helps to build up that relationship of trust. So moving on to community, that question of how do you design a public service so that the users of that service connect with each other? If you think about, like, you know, that the example I always give is the Full Monty, where, you know, I'm sure most of you will have seen the movie, and it's about people who lose their job, and part of, you know, they get their, you know, connection back to each other and to a sense of purpose by becoming strippers. That is not a great career option. Nevertheless, for me, the iconic scene is when they are standing in the queue at the job centre and they start to dance. And for me, it feels particularly iconic because now the way that you claim benefits is you sit alone at a computer screen and you type information about yourself to an anonymous computer. And I'm really interested in us thinking about, who do you meet when you're interacting with public services? And it may be so efficient to design services so that people can interact with the state in an automated way. But there is something that you lose if you are not enabling, encouraging, permitting people to actually connect with others. And it's those peer networks that can often be absolutely essential in helping people to find a job, to conquer their diabetes, to rebuild a community centre, to tackle crime, whatever it might be. So how does service design itself help to encourage and enable relationships between those service user groups, like parents, like the users of a park, friends of groups, neighbourhood groups, community groups, neighbourhood watch, whatever it might be? How can you actually make it easier for people to participate and build those relationships? So again, in our polling, 74% of people said that they wanted that opportunity to discuss local authority policies with other local people. And this is just one example of somebody saying, actually, if the council's promoting, a grassroots litter pick Facebook group, it helps. It doesn't, there's 1,000 ways you can get litter picked up, right? But if you get litter picked up by helping to catalyze the existence of a community group, that is connection and solidarity and relationships that happen as a side effect of trying to achieve the particular goal that you have set out for. And it doesn't matter what it is. Is there a community-based, relationship-building way to deliver the policy outcome for the same money, for less money? Even if it's, because you have to think about the impact, the side effects that your policy, that your choice of delivering your outcome secures. And then coming back to that kind of central thought about relationships. And this is really difficult, right? Because from an efficiency perspective, it very, very often seems much better to have, so you can manage shifts and so that you can have move capacity around to meet demand, is that you just want to treat every minute of all of the different staff time as essentially fungible, transferable. And maybe it's okay for lots of medical experiences or even care experiences, or bin collecting, which is the kind of the thing that is often held up as the ultimate in transactional services. People just want their bin collected. But actually, and again, I recognize it often comes with huge costs, because you need to sort of build in redundancy to enable the ability to people to have a sustained relationship with a service provider, is that you can get quite a different set of trust outcomes, quite a different set of community outcomes, and also then a kind of level of community surveillance and relationship building, which you will never get with purely transactional services. Is actually in one of the government's consultations about public health reform, was suggesting that bin men, those transactional service providers, could offer a level of community surveillance about people who aren't putting their bins out. There's also a question of, exactly how you encourage and enable people to recycle better. Actually, maybe refuse collectors, if they could help take responsibility and a leadership role in a community, maybe you would get a different outcome. I'm using them not because I'm obsessed with waste collection, but because it's so often put into examples as, obviously we should have relationship model for some services like midwives, and some are just transactional like the bins. But I really think we should question that. Something is lost when you don't have a relationship with your service provider, when you are treating the acquisition of that service as a citizen. And what's lost is the experience of, when you're treating it as a consumer rather than as a citizen. And if you want to build up their citizen skill set, you actually have to think about people's relationships with the providers of their services. And again, that's something I think came out of the pandemic, a much greater understanding that the service providers were human beings too. And that leads to greater tolerance in a good way, but also greater commitment to funding of public services. If you feel like what they're delivering for you is about a human connection. That's why people will often, pay a bit more in a local shop where they can get advice and talk to a real human being. So lots of people say that this is important to them. And of course, there are bits and pieces that it makes total sense to automate and to put into kind of data provision. But when people are making that first connection, the power of a face-to-face relationship and the power of seeing the same person over and over has real value. And again, the more those relationships are established, the more people are willing to participate. And I was reading a paper earlier from New Philanthropy Capital by a guy who's a trustee at Lankelly Chase. He also runs Expert Citizens. And it was really fascinating. He just, as an aside in the paper, he said, and this, this is like pioneering CEO, so much social capital, so much confidence. And he said, I've been a trustee at Lankelly Chase for 2 years and I'm only just starting to feel comfortable. And that's that sense of how long it takes to build a trusted relationship where people are willing to participate, and how much, but what a dividend it can offer if you're willing to invest that time. So this is, where we're going to move on to a discussion, because I really, this is mostly a kind of theoretical approach and a public engagement approach. And I really want to know about, from that community of practice, what is it? What are the challenges? What are the possibilities? What are the opportunities? And where are great things happening? So back to Noel.
Thank you very much, Polly. That was a great whistle-stop tour through the work that you've been doing and some of the challenges and opportunities that relational public services face. I think that kind of the example you give about waste collection is so important, and I think some people have commented on it in the chat, because it kind of is exactly kind of the type of role where actually should be more empowered to be kind of more relational. We've got the eyes and the ears on the street, kind of with residents, perhaps much more than certain roles like mine, who are kind of more in the kind of the in the background. And I think it's really interesting when you talked about the 3 relational pillars. And I was particularly struck by the second pillar about peers and networks, because I think that's one of the areas where local government is only at kind of at the foothills, and I think we kind of really look forward to seeing the kind of research and kind of what residents think about this in the context of local government. As Polly said, we're now going to go into breakouts to kind of to discuss these questions, because I think it's really important to get the perspective from different organisations. We've got a range of those today, but also different roles. I think people introducing themselves in the chat shows the different roles, and actually those different roles have different implications when it comes to what we can do to make those services kind of more relational. In the spirit of kind of digital, as you're going into your kind of breakout groups, kind of do introduce yourselves when you're into those breakout groups. So that's also a way to make those relational. And I'll share the questions that Polly put into her presentation, kind of in a message. We've created this Jamboard so that when you're in your kind of breakout groups, do kind of note down the kind of how that's kind of playing out for you, as well as having that discussion, because I think that'll be a really good takeaway, both for people who are here going forwards back into your organisations, and as well as people who couldn't make it today, to kind of to see how that what are those challenges and opportunities, and also what are you doing, what are you trying to do to develop more relational services as well. And I think kind of we can all be humble, as Polly said. So it doesn't need to be a big transformational program to be a legitimate relational public service. It can be those interventions that actually kind of make a difference. So bear with me one moment while I get the tech to be able to allocate kind of people into breakout rooms. So we're gonna come back at 10:02. If you could nominate someone, and I know this is always the kind of the popular part of the session, but if you could nominate someone to feedback and do try and kind of capture the discussion in the Jamboard as well. That would be that'd be really great. And kind of the main questions is kind of what does this mean in terms of kind of your practice in your roles? What challenges and opportunities are there, and what tools and methods can help? And I'll play in those messages into the chat so that you don't need to remember them. So we'll see you in about 20 minutes. And I'm going to open the breakout rooms now. So you should all be disappearing into different breakout groups. Great. I think we've got people back in. Before we kind of say kind of a big thanks to Polly and kind of next steps, it'd be great to kind of hear some feedback from each of the groups. So it'd be great if we could hear from Breakout Room 1. Feedback. What are the key things that kind of came out for you? Anyone who'd like to volunteer sharing the insights from that group?
For what group? I'm not. Will they know what group they were in? I'm afraid I don't know which group I was in.
No.
It's a first principle, I guess.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I think we were in group 4, Jean.
Okay, thank you, Yanis.
Let's start the other. Let's start with group 4 then. Maybe Jean, as you started, maybe.
That's my penalty for speaking up. That'll teach me. I'm sorry. I've done an absolutely kind of terrible job of taking notes, and we didn't use the Jamboard, so I'm really sorry. I'll pull out kind of, I think, kind of maybe 3 of the kind of key messages for me, but then if I can ask my, if the kind of group I was in doesn't feel I've kind of covered points, please shout. So I think the key things I could have noted down and kind of took away was, I think kind of firstly, sort of not getting the need not to get bogged down in the sort of the theory, kind of behind kind of relational working, not to over kind of professionalize actually kind of what we would kind of recognize as a kind of new way of working. So kind of I confess, we're currently trying to recruit an experienced kind of participation kind of professional, and a really kind of good challenge I got that from the group was, why don't you look to your local people, because actually maybe their kind of lived experience and their knowledge of kind of community is equally valuable. So there's really, there's something kind of about that kind of point that was really kind of important. In our group is that it's really easy to kind of fall into using very kind of technical language about this issue, and actually kind of rather than talking about or using kind of technical terms that aren't accessible to kind of residents or wider groups, why don't we kind of talk about kind of the kind of core essence of what we are really kind of about, which is would be about things like sharing control or sharing power with people. The third point I really kind of loved was the kind of connection into kind of into health outcomes, and the kind of just the kind of recognition that actually kind of having control over your own destiny in life is likely to have some really kind of pronounced kind of health benefits, and that's recognised in a really weighty kind of public health evidence base, and I think has kind of been explored in a number of programs, but probably doesn't get enough attention. And then just more widely, I think there was some really interesting discussion about kind of how do you animate kind of peer networks or kind of grassworks kind of movements for kind of change, and kind of tap into those as part of kind of relational kind of working, bridging different kind of organizational and sort of sectoral boundaries. So I'll kind of stop there, but do jump in if I've missed anything out.
That's great. Let's move to the group which had Kieran, Janine, and Matt in it.
Okay, hi everyone. I agreed to feedback. Some sort of scattered points, I'm afraid. Yeah, perhaps like others, we didn't fully follow what we were supposed to be doing. So not lots of practical examples, but we did heard from a colleague who works in highways and reactive maintenance, talked about the way that they've re-engineered some of their work around sort of neighbourhood focus and neighbourhood management, so as that residents have a better chance to have a say in the way that some of this works. We talked about some of the bigger sort of programs that have happened over the last sort of decade or so that have moved us in this direction. So the fantastic 21st century public servant research and work that looked at some of the skills that you'd need that have, I think, some of that humility that Polly talked about sort of at its heart, at the core of what they're thinking about, particularly around things like resource weaving and understanding who's got what and how can we make more than the sum of our parts. And also a bit around the point I'd made earlier about making every contact count, you know, that again, like done in the right way, where you build that into the culture of your organization. Actually, there are interesting touch points where people can make more of the way that they support people now into having more of a relationship to think about support on both sides. Janine made a really good point about some of the challenges, some of the sort of infrastructural challenges of this work. That, you know, a lot of our organisations remain very focused on targets, on performance monitoring, commissioning frameworks, sort of focused on efficiency, which makes it really hard to then support a sort of a system-wide or even just organisation-wide approach to shifting the dial towards more sort of relational support. Then we ended up on a really big conversation about ethics, around this sort of the ethics of relationships and trust, partly around expectation, so what we think citizens and residents might expect of our services, but also then linked to that really explicit need to get consent for all the bits that we do, and which I think comes back to the point about allowing people to make their own decisions, but also about making sure that people understand where in a relationship they are when they start to contact different parts of the public sector.
That's great. Thank you very much, Matt. Unfortunately, for the two other breakout groups, I think we've run out of time. But that's an incentive for you to share your feedback onto the onto the Jam boards. I think it's a really great discussion, and there's a variety of kind of different strands kind of emanating out of this, which could all be kind of worked up and kind of developed in their own way. But before we do go our separate paths to other meetings, if we could all unmute and give Polly a big round of applause for her presentation. That's probably the only way you can replicate kind of a face-to-face meeting. Polly, I didn't know whether you wanted to say anything else about kind of like reports coming out or kind of next steps on the work.
Well, just mostly that I'm really keen to collaborate with anyone, hear about what you guys are working on. We also, it's a sort of topic for a different thing, but it came up in our conversation in the breakout group, is around participation technology. So we build and deploy participation technology at Demos as well. So if that might be of service to anyone in their work, then we'd love to hear from you about that. So please do either drop me or Kieran a line. I will chuck our email addresses in the chat. But yeah, always keen to hear from you, to be of service, to find ways to collaborate. We are open for business.
That's great. And if any of you kind of taken part want to showcase one of your relational public services in action for like a future session, then kind of do get in touch. That would be great. But for the moment, just going to wish everyone a good rest of the afternoon. And thanks again, Polly, and for everyone for taking part. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers. Bye.
Very much all. Bye-bye.